For decades, Vietnam War veteran Jim Harrison's heroism was stolen, his hard-earned medal claimed by the very commander he trusted most. Colonel Rick Blake, hiding behind rank and influence, built a false legacy at the expense of Jim's sacrifices and the lives of his fallen comrades. But when Jim gathered irrefutable evidence and rallied the voices of those who had fought beside him, the truth turned the tables in a way no one expected. And just wait until you see how justice finally prevailed, restoring honor and delivering a long-awaited reckoning. James Jim Harrison had always carried his past like a second skin. Every morning, even decades after leaving the jungles of Vietnam behind, he would touch the medal pinned to his chest in his old photographs and remember the moment he earned it. It wasn't just medal and ribbon, it was a testament to courage, sacrifice, and the loyalty of the men who had fought beside him. Every scar on his body, every sleepless night, every lost friend was etched into that small emblem. It was his honor, his history, and a symbol that his bravery had mattered. Jim had never sought recognition. The war had taken enough from him. Yet the medal had been a quiet reminder that, for at least one fleeting moment, his efforts had been acknowledged. It was proof that what he had done in those perilous days had a name, a face, and a place in the record. But that fragile sense of justice was about to shatter in a way Jim could never have anticipated. It started innocuously, like a whisper of disbelief that slowly grew into a thunderclap. While attending a reunion of veterans in his hometown, Jim overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. Colonel Richard "Rick" Blake, his former commander, was standing at the podium, recounting stories of heroism during the war. Jim had expected respect for the team, for the squad, for the countless shared struggles, but then Rick lifted the medal Jim had earned, gesturing toward it as if it were his own. "This was my victory," Rick claimed, voice steady, eyes scanning the crowd for validation. For a moment, Jim froze, unable to process the words. His mind reeled. The man he had trusted implicitly, the one who had led them through ambushes, harrowing missions, and impossible nights, was rewriting history. The betrayal was almost too much to bear. Memories, sharp and vivid, assaulted him. The night patrol through the dense forest, the mission when a teammate had shielded him from harm, the countless times he had risked his life so that others might live. And now, all of that, every ounce of courage and sacrifice, was being claimed as someone else's triumph. His chest tightened, not from physical exertion, but from the ache of disbelief. A hollow, sinking feeling spread through him, as though the floor beneath his feet had vanished. He could see the faces of other veterans, some nodding in polite approval, others watching the scene in stunned silence. The injustice cut deep, sharper than any wound he had sustained overseas. The medal, once a quiet emblem of honor, now felt like a cruel symbol of erasure, a lie imposed on the truth of his life. Jim's thoughts raced. How could someone so trusted turn out to be a thief of history, a manipulator of memory? How could decades of integrity, courage, and sacrifice be so easily rewritten by one man's audacity? The very foundation of his belief in fairness, in the recognition of truth, seemed to crumble in that instant. Shock was not just an emotion, it was a physical weight pressing down, leaving him breathless and disoriented. Yet beneath the initial paralysis, a flicker of clarity emerged. Jim realized that this moment, painful as it was, could not erase who he was or what he had done. The memory of his friends, their faces and sacrifices, remained untouched by lies. Even if history had been temporarily bent, the truth of his actions, the reality of his bravery, was indelible. But first, he had to face the shock, the betrayal, and the bitter realization that someone he had trusted had claimed the story of his life as their own. The shock had not yet faded when Jim realized that it was giving way to something far more corrosive: hatred. A slow-burning fire that grew in the depths of his chest every time he thought of Rick Blake. At first, it was a quiet resentment, a whisper of injustice that he tried to push away, telling himself that life had already taken enough. But the more he saw Rick enjoying the recognition that was rightfully his, the more that quiet ember turned into a consuming blaze. Every morning, on his walk through the small town where he had settled after the war, Jim passed the local military memorial. Names of heroes etched into polished stone caught his eye, but time and fate had left his own contributions unacknowledged. Rick's name appeared frequently in speeches, plaques, and ceremonial events, each instance a fresh wound. The irony was cruel. Here was a man who had benefited from Jim's bravery, who had appropriated decades of honor while Jim's own valor was overlooked, and the world seemed oblivious. The resentment began to coalesce into a sharper, more focused hatred. It wasn't just anger at the theft of a medal. It was fury at the audacity, the boldness, and the disrespect. Jim thought of all the promises they had made to one another, the brotherhood of their unit, the silent codes that had governed life in the most dangerous circumstances. Rick had violated every one of them, and in doing so, he had desecrated the memory of every comrade who had given everything for each other. Jim could not let that pass unchallenged. Memories of his fallen friends, faces frozen in his mind from long ago, stirred the embers of anger into a firestorm. Each memory reminded him that heroism was not about rank or speeches or public accolades. It was about actions, choices made in moments of peril, and the courage to stand firm when everything seemed to crumble. And yet, here was Rick, basking in the glow of recognition for acts that were not his own. Jim's fists clenched instinctively, the weight of injustice pressing down on him, mingled with a gnawing sense of vulnerability. How had one man managed to rewrite decades of truth without consequence? The community, unaware of the real story, seemed to accept Rick's narrative without question. That indifference, that quiet complicity, only fueled Jim's sense of outrage. He realized that this was not a fight that could be waged quietly or with polite words. The antagonist he faced was cunning, experienced, and shielded by rank and influence. Rick had weaponized reputation, charisma, and position to suppress the truth. And the more Jim considered the depth of that deception, the more he understood the enormity of the task ahead. Yet buried beneath the hatred, there was a strange clarity. Jim's fury was proof of his enduring commitment to truth, to honor, and to those who could no longer speak for themselves. The fire within him became a guiding force, illuminating the path toward justice. He would not rest. He would not bend. He would ensure that the sacrifices of his friends and his own courage were acknowledged. And in that realization, the hatred, though bitter, became a source of resolve, a weapon to fuel a fight that he knew was far from over. The quiet resentment that had simmered for years finally reached a breaking point. Jim could no longer sit in silence, allowing the stolen recognition to stand unchallenged. One morning, he woke with a sharp clarity. He had to act. The injustice was no longer just an abstract wound. It was a concrete, burning call to reclaim what was rightfully his. Rage, long nurtured in the depths of memory and reflection, surged forward, transforming grief and bitterness into relentless determination. Jim began his mission meticulously. He revisited old photographs, images captured in fleeting moments of valor during missions that tested every ounce of courage he had. Faces of comrades long gone stared back at him, reminding him that he carried a responsibility beyond himself. Each photograph became a piece of evidence, a fragment of truth that could not be silenced by deceit. He dug through combat operation reports, some faded and yellowed, others tucked away in dusty archives. Each document reaffirmed the reality of his contributions and the undeniable chronology of events that Rick had attempted to claim as his own. The hardest part was tracking down his fellow soldiers. Many had moved on, lives reshaped by decades of post-war challenges. Yet when Jim reached out, their voices carried a shared understanding, a rekindled bond forged in fire and adversity. Testimonies poured in, each account a building block of irrefutable truth. The soldiers spoke not only of Jim's courage, but of Rick's opportunism, providing detailed recollections that would pierce through layers of deception. Listening to them, Jim felt the raw intensity of both rage and hope intertwining. Rage gave him energy, hope gave him direction. Every step was exhausting, physically and emotionally. But Jim drew strength from the fire within him. Rage had sharpened his focus, transforming his frustration into actionable resolve. The nights were long, filled with careful cross-checking of dates, events, and personal accounts. But with each verified detail, he felt the walls of injustice begin to tremble. He knew this was more than reclaiming a medal. It was restoring the truth for everyone who had been overlooked, misrepresented, or forgotten. Finally, the day came to confront the system directly. Jim presented his meticulously assembled evidence to the military commission. The room was tense, each page and photograph an assertion of reality against a backdrop of deceit. Rick, sitting across the table, attempted to maintain composure, offering half-hearted denials and rehearsed explanations. But the proof was undeniable. Photographic evidence, official reports, and Personal testimonies formed a comprehensive web that left no room for doubt. As Jim spoke, detailing each mission and every act of valor, his rage crystallized into a precise, controlled force. It was no longer uncontrolled anger. It was purpose sharpened by years of injustice. With every document laid out, every witness account read aloud, he felt the power of truth asserting itself. The narrative Rick had constructed for decades began to collapse, piece by piece, under the weight of verifiable facts. The injustice that had haunted Jim's life for so long started to crumble before his eyes, leaving him not just satisfied, but resolute. Justice was finally within reach. After decades of living in the shadow of stolen recognition, the long-awaited day finally arrived. Jim stood in the crisp morning air, surrounded by a gathering of veterans, family, and community members, all waiting to witness a moment that had been denied him for far too long. The medal that had been taken, the symbol of his courage and sacrifice, gleamed under the sunlight, finally returning to its rightful place on his chest. It was more than a piece of metal. It was the tangible affirmation of truth, honor, and years of perseverance. The ceremony was solemn, yet charged with quiet excitement. Jim's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the medal, a lifetime of emotion coursing through him. Memories of the jungles, the missions, the camaraderie, and the sacrifices of friends flooded his mind. Each moment felt vivid again, not as a haunting shadow, but as a living testament to their bravery and his own. The injustice that had weighed so heavily on his spirit for decades seemed to lift, replaced by a profound sense of recognition and closure. Rick Blake, once so confident in his false claim, now faced official consequences. The commission had documented his appropriation of Jim's achievements, and the charge carried the weight of both legal and moral acknowledgement. Seeing Rick confronted by the undeniable truth, Jim felt no joy in humiliation. Instead, there was a deep sense of balance restored. Justice was not a fleeting victory. It was a validation of integrity, the triumph of honesty over deceit. As the medal was pinned back onto Jim's chest, applause broke out among the hundreds of witnesses. The sound was overwhelming, reverberating through the courtyard and into his chest, mingling with tears he could no longer hold back. Joy, relief, and a profound sense of triumph flowed together, a flood of emotion decades in the making. This was not merely a personal victory, it was the recognition of the sacrifices of his comrades who had never returned home, whose courage had been silenced by time and treachery. For Jim, the medal symbolized their voices as much as his own. Jim's eyes scanned the crowd, seeing faces reflecting admiration, respect, and solidarity. Each hand extended in applause was a small echo of the countless acknowledgments that had been denied him for so long. The moment was larger than himself. It was a celebration of truth, of bravery acknowledged, and of a life's worth of perseverance finally honored. The weight of injustice, the bitterness of betrayal, the intensity of rage, all of it had transformed into a radiant sense of fulfillment. As the ceremony concluded, Jim allowed himself to breathe fully for the first time in years. The medal rested on his chest, heavy with history, but it was a comforting weight, a reminder that perseverance and courage had not been wasted. He felt a renewed faith in the idea that truth, no matter how long it is obscured, eventually prevails. The satisfaction he experienced was profound, the kind that settles deep into one's bones. A life's worth of effort, struggle, and integrity finally recognized. And in that quiet moment, with the applause echoing around him, Jim Harrison knew something essential and enduring. Justice, though delayed, had arrived, and the honor of his friends and his own legacy had been restored.